Well, good morning, good afternoon. Welcome all to the webinar that ISD is hosting on sustainability standards and commodity prices, how to better support farmers' livelihoods. I am Cristina Larrea, lead of the Sustainability Standards work stream at ISD, and it is my pleasure to be one of the moderator sessions. Why can't we pay more to farmers? The women and men that grow the cotton of the t-shirt that we wear, the coffee that we drink, or the cocoa that we eat in our chocolate bars? That's the question that we have asked ourselves multiple times. And I'm sure that some of you who are here with us today, you have asked this question too. At ISD, we have worked in the field of sustainability standards for about 15 years. We have found that standards can contribute to improve the livelihoods of farmers. They can help advance production practices that protect the environment and benefit communities. And they can motivate more responsible consumption and sourcing patterns. However, these schemes operate in a market economy where power relations, government interventions, and financial stock exchanges also influence farmers' incomes and the price they obtain from the products they sell. Well, in today's session, you will learn about how sustainability standards are helping to increase farmer prices and incomes and where there is room for improvement. You will also learn about what commodity buyers and governments do and could do to support farmers' livelihoods. The findings that we are presented today come from our second series of global market reports that we launched over the past year with the support from the government of Sweden, which are focused on commodity prices and sustainability. I'm delighted to have here with me my colleague Stephanie Bermudez, policy advisor at ISD, who is our expert on prices and one of the main authors of this series of reports. We also have with us a distinguished lineup of experts that we will introduce later on, to whom you will be able to engage and ask questions. Let me quickly review the agenda for today. Stephanie will present the findings of the research. Then we will have a dialogue with our experts split into two parts. The first part will focus on price transparency or discovery, and the second part will focus on prices and premiums and cost of externalities. You will have the opportunity to ask questions between the two parts, so I invite you to write your question in the chat or in the Q&A box. Then we will invite our distinguished commentator to share her thoughts and comment on the discussion. After her comments, you will have another opportunity to ask questions before the closing remarks. Without further ado, I invite my colleague Stephanie to speak. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Cristina, for this introduction, and good morning, good afternoon to all of you joining us today. My name is Stephanie Bermudez. I'm policy advisor at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, and I'm one of the authors of this series of reports. So today I will share with you some of the findings from these reports that we did for 8 commodity sectors, including bananas, cocoa, coffee, cotton, palm oil, soybeans, sugar, and tea. And in these reports, we looked at the factors that influence farmers' prices and incomes, as well as we analyzed also how voluntary sustainability standards are making a difference to farmers associated with them. We also provide some recommendations on how these voluntary sustainability standards and other value chain actors across value chains can support higher prices and incomes for farmers. So the overarching findings from these reports, overall, we found that farmers implementing more sustainable practices and that are associated with one or more voluntary sustainability standards are more protected from price volatility in the international markets than farmers producing and selling conventional products. We also found that standard compliant farmers tend to receive higher prices than those selling conventional products, and these can range between 20 to 50% higher prices. However, the ability of these voluntary sustainability standards to increase prices and incomes in some of these markets is limited by aspects embedded in the market economy and how prices are determined in conventional markets, including the market concentration and power dynamics and the role of the futures market. So we conclude that it's necessary to rethink the design and implementation of price models and other supporting measures to generate a greater impact on farmers' livelihoods, including higher prices and incomes. And this relates to the focus of today's discussion, which is enhancing price transparency and the potential to adjust premiums received by standard compliant producers based on the true price of their crops or products. So we know that many factors already influence the prices and incomes that farmers receive, and these go from aspects at the farm level, like production volumes, production costs, the degree of value addition or farmers organizations, to those at more national, local level and macro or international level. Of course, the demand and supply dynamics are a key factor. But all these factors influence prices and incomes that farmers receive. And voluntary sustainability standards operate at the confluence of all these trends and issues and can be seen as meso-level entities with the potential to bridge between these levels. Another important point or issue that we mention in the reports is the inequality in the value distribution across commodity sectors. Overall, the greatest economic value is concentrated at the downstream levels of the value chain. And this happens across all the sectors that we examine. So for instance, producers, they retain from about 2% to 50% of the value. Processors are traders. We see they don't capture much of the value. However, they are usually the ones generating higher profits as they commercialize or move large volumes of these crops. And manufacturers and retailers, they retain more value, and also they have more possibilities to react or have access to risk management tools to protect themselves from market fluctuations. So overall, farmers and producers in these commodity sectors that we analyze are the ones receiving the lowest prices and margins across the value chain. And they are also in a vulnerable position as they don't have the capacity to influence these market prices, but also they are the first to experience the effects of the climate change. So this has a big impact on the price and incomes that they receive. So we analyzed also what are these voluntary sustainability standards doing to increase farm gate prices and incomes. And we found that they provide two types of benefits. The first one are direct measures that include initiatives or programs that are formalized by voluntary sustainability standards. And this includes mandatory minimum prices that actually Fairtrade International is the only one that is that does this, and it includes a fixed minimum price that also vary depending on the quality, type, or the origin of the product. And these are prices that must be paid by buyers to compliant farmers or cooperatives. But we also found that there are premium models or sustainability differentials implemented by other standards like fair trade or Rainforest Alliance or organic. There are additional payments that buyers make to compliant farmers, and these premiums can be fixed or not and are paid on top of the minimum price or the selling price. And also some standards like Rainforest Alliance are working on sustainability investments, and others are working towards implementing or working with benchmarks to influence living income and living wages. And we have records of Fairtrade International, Bonsucro that are working towards this. On indirect benefits or measures, our research shows that farmers participated in voluntary sustainability standards receive benefits that translate into better prices and incomes. And these benefits can be grouped into access to improved production conditions, like improved agricultural practices and quality, and access to inputs. And those benefits on improved market positioning. And this relates to better access to extension services and markets and better relation with buyers. Of course, this is not always, not all the time, as we will see, and benefits are very context specific. So this is one example of our analysis on price data and on prices and premiums offered by sustainability standards versus conventional prices from 2012 to 2022. And it shows that producers in major producing and exporting countries associated with at least one standard may have received higher prices than conventional farmers. And this analysis includes data from fair trade and organic schemes based on available data. We have also included some data on average premiums obtained for palm oil and sugarcane producers through credit transactions on RSPO and bone sucrose trading platforms. And overall, we found that the lowest benefits or increases in prices for standard compliant producers were found on tea, where average auction prices and standard compliant prices were at the same level. So there is no higher prices for standard compliant producers. And on palm oil, as we only analyze prices and premiums obtained through credit transactions and not on physical trade or sales. So there is a data limitation here. The highest increase in prices were found in the banana sector, with farmers receiving up to 50% higher prices. And this case stands out because the conventional producer prices for bananas in the countries that we analyzed are extremely low. So that's why we see this price gap. And for coffee, cotton, and cocoa, they received about 20% higher prices, which is this information is consistent with what other analyses and studies have found. And of course, these information don't reflect a situation of all standard compliant products producers in all origins. Also, this analysis is at FOB level, at export level. So as we were not able to access solid data on prices received back at farm gate, and also we were not able to access data on prices received by farmers complying with other standards, but we would love to include them in future reports. So as I mentioned, this information or these findings are consistent with the evidence that we found in second literature, where research actually indicates that standards have overall positive impact on prices, that also farmers earn higher prices from, an average of 20% to 30% higher prices than farmers selling conventional products. However, the effects on incomes are mixed or limited due to different ag factors, and because higher prices don't necessarily mean higher incomes due to increased costs that farmers may incur when adopting certifications. And also there is few evidence, but there are some studies showing that premiums offset the cost of adopting standards. There is one example on banana that we included in the report. So we evidenced a link or consistency between these results that we have found and what other studies show. However, there are some limitations as on minimum prices and premium models, only one standard has defined or formalized a mechanism to determine mandatory minimum prices. Also, not all standards have defined premiums or differentials for farmers. And there are concerns that these prices and premiums are insufficient to cover production costs or to increase farm incomes, even when the prices exceed the conventional market prices. And finally, conventional commodity prices are the main reference to define standard compliant prices and premiums. And these don't consider yet other issues or other variables like the implementation of sustainable practices with positive results or the cost of externalities. Also, it is not clear in some cases, in some commodity markets, it is not clear whether farmers actually receive premiums. And also buyers may be more willing to pay premium differentials when international prices are low. So buyers don't always pay the premiums. And also there is the issue of limited market demand that we also mentioned in the reports. In some sectors, there is an oversupply of standard compliant products, and this results in farmers selling certified production as conventional, and this of course limits the potential to receive higher prices. We also have here, I will go quickly through here. Other actors are also implementing different measures. For instance, farmers are also implementing crop and diversification measures. Governments are responding also with price controls. Some of them have minimum prices in place, minimum support prices, like the cocoa sector, or more recently in Kenya, that has established a minimum price for Kenyan tea sold at the Mombasa action. And also they implement other countries' subsidies and funds to stabilize prices. And also we found that some supply chain actors like buyers and traders are also involved by, for instance, offering premiums based on quality. Some of them are also looking at living income approach and offering better contracting terms. So, based on all these, we were questioning through the making process of the reports, why are prices and premiums for standard compliant products based on prices for conventional ones or the international market prices? Is there a way to change this and actually reward farmers for their efforts? So we consider, and this is part of our recommendations, that there is an opportunity to internalize the external costs of conventional production that will make standard compliant prices more competitive with conventional ones. And we know this is very challenging, but this goes to the source of the problem. So we propose that there is a potential to determine new price models that consider the social and environmental cost savings of adopting standard compliant practices. And for this to happen, a strong effort on data will be needed. We also acknowledge that some standards are working towards living income and living wage references, which is great, but it is needed to adopt these models across the board. Because as I mentioned, most of the standards, the sustainability standards that we analyzed have not formalized minimum prices and premiums yet, and most of the traders and buyers take the international market price as a reference to set premiums for these certified products. And third is to establish mechanisms to ensure that farmers receive the premiums. And this is related to the issue of price transparency and transmission. There is a need for strong efforts in obtaining and sharing data on prices, not only at FOB level or export level, but back to farm gate. And this is one of the difficulties that we encounter while doing this analysis. And also to scale up, standards should be able to measure their impacts on prices and incomes. And this will be beneficial not only to farmers that want to engage with these standards and expand the use of these tools, but it will be also a useful resource to show the business case of standard compliant practices. We also included some recommendations related to the interaction of standards with other actors. And of course, we mentioned the issue of price determination, but in the meantime, some other actors like the private sector actors or governments can work towards expanding monetary incentives for sustainable growing practices like carbon capture or payment for ecosystem services or more access to credit. And we also mentioned the need for collaborating with the standards to enhance price transparency. So, and also, of course, promoting value addition and market demand for standard compliant products, not only in traditional markets, but also in new potential markets. So I conclude here my presentation. Thank you for your attention. And before we go to our panel, let's launch a quick poll on what do you think standards should prioritize. So yeah, we are between implementing price transparency mechanisms and adjust price determination models. Great, thank you for your responses. Now let's move to the panel discussion. And before we proceed with the introductions, please don't hesitate to submit your questions in the Q&A box, and we will address them during the Q&A session following the panel discussion. So I would like to extend a warm welcome to our panel of remarkable women dedicated to advancing fair prices and incomes for farmers, each of them contributing from their unique expertise in their fields. So let me start by introducing Dr. Charlotte Eva. She's a lecturer in economics at the University of the West of Scotland. She's also a member of the Centre for African Research on Enterprise and Economic Development. And her research focuses on international trade issues, especially on market institutions and their impact. Charlotte has been a consistent participant as an expert in the multi-year expert meeting on commodities and development organized by the UNCTAD over the past 4 years. Welcome, Dr. Charlotte. We also have Ms. Julie Francoeur. She's the CEO of Fairtrade Canada. And Julie has been with Fairtrade for over a decade, running field operations for Fairtrade International and working from the ground with farmers, brands, cooperatives, governments, and other value chain actors in several developing countries. And she also sits on the global executive team of Fairtrade International. Thank you so much, Julie, for joining us today. We have also Ms. Andrea Rusman. She leads the Responsible Value Chains team at the Impact Institute, and she has worked with the Impact Institute or TruePrice for 8 years and has managed several projects on impact measurement and management. She's been very involved in the development of methodologies on impact measurement and evaluation of natural and social capital costs, particularly in farmer household income and living income. Thank you, Andrea, and we look very much forward to your remarks. Thank you. And we also have Ms. Emily Stone. She's the CEO and founder of Uncommon Cacao, a group of companies involved in cocoa buying, post-harvest processing, and export operations in Central America. And they import and distribute in the US and Europe. They are pioneers in advancing transparent trade and ethical sourcing in the cocoa sector. Thank you very much, Emily. So I think there is no doubt on the level of this great panel, and I'm sure the audience will appreciate your remarks. Thank you so much. We will start with a round focus on price transparency. And maybe we can start with Dr. Charlotte. So based on your outstanding expertise on this issue of price transparency and dissemination in several agricultural value chains, what do you think are the most promising initiatives or mechanisms that can be put in place to enable farmers and other actors in the value chains to access market price transparency?
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Christina. Thank you for the hosting of our ISSB. And also, I would like to say thank you to my fellow panelists. I thank you for the great opportunity to come and share some of my viewpoints on the commodity issues around the commodities. You probably will not know, but I come from a cocoa and coffee background. So the impact of the issue that we are discussing today, these are issues that I have lived the impact, and I have a good understanding of it coming from that background. So before we can mention what can be the promising mechanism, we need to understand, first of all, what are the key issues affecting the sector. And I personally believe that based on the analysis that I have done so far, we need the sector. I'm talking here about maybe coffee and cocoa. This is where I have done quite a few studies. So for these two commodities, I believe that we need to come up with mechanisms that can provide a structural change in the sector. we are now mentioning transparency. Why do we talk about transparency? We talk about transparency because we know that we have information failure within that market that actually make the market inefficient. So in order to implement something, we need a mechanism that can actually respond more positively or effectively to those challenges. I personally believe that market institutions, such as a local commodity, has the potential to respond to much of those needs. Here, we are talking about transparency, for instance, information transparency. There's a lot of asymmetrical of information going on in the sector. We have, on one hand, buyers who have all the information about price, about market, versus a whole group of farmers who have absolutely no clue about what is going on. It's clear that the group which has the information can take advantage of the group which does not understand what is going on in the market. So that being the case, what we need is to have an institution between the two, an independent institution between the two, which can provide the same amount of information to all the market actors, which allow each actor to be able to make informed decisions. And what such a mechanism to me is the local commodity exchange, because they have the potential to disseminate market information regarding price and all the rest of it to all the actors, including farmers, because farmers who are connected to the exchange can receive instant message on their phone telling them exactly what is happening in the market. And that obviously put them in a better position when it comes to negotiation the farm gate price with the buyers. But when farmers have absolutely no clue, that is difficult. Another way that these buyers also can take advantage of our farmers is because they are in majority, they are illiterate. And because they are illiterate, they cannot distinguish between the quality of their own product and other people, and they cannot also understand what is the actual quantity or the weight of what they have. Again, they get a con on that. Another aspect of the commodity exchange is to be able to provide accurate information on the quality and the quantity of the product, because they are independent. So that, to me, if we are talking about having a promising mechanism to increase transparency, establishing commodity exchange throughout these producing countries, to me, is the most promising solution that I can bring. So thank you very much for now.
Thank you, Dr. Charlotte. This is great. I think the information sharing is key on the quality and quantity, and also the role of independent institutions to share this information. Thank you very much, Dr. Charlotte. So now maybe we can move to Julie. And Julie, as we have seen, fair trade is among the few voluntary sustainability standards that have implemented, or the only that have implemented, a mandatory minimum price and premiums to producers. But we have also seen that generally these premiums and prices are communicated at FOB level or the export level. So why do the fair trade minimum prices and premiums refer only to FOB and not to farm gate as well?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Stephanie. It's the fair trade minimum prices were first created in coffee in like the late 80s. So we're talking about something that was created long before we exist today in fair trade as a current known, international certification and advocacy organization. And it was created because of everything we've discussed earlier, that the market does not self-regulate, that the market does not bring information to producers in a way that's transparent, and that if you let the supply chains to themselves, they don't negotiate on behalf of farmers. And so we needed something that was mandatory within a voluntary standard. So, within the voluntary landscape is what can be the most mandatory is to say you need to pay at least this, which in essence, many through crop subsidies or agricultural subsidies. Many northern countries have done with their agriculture to say, at least we will ensure that our farmers or corn farmers or soy farmers make at least this, right? So a lot of agricultural bodies have been fixing their own agricultural background by the idea of introducing a fixed level of minimal income to farmers. So, and mixed with also the core belief that we have in fair trade that farmers, especially smallholders, are better together, and that a big part of collective bargaining and collective servicing is by being together, either in an association, a co-op, a federation, for multiple reasons, not just to get better services, but also even, getting bank loans to invest in their own community or other needs. And so the idea of the collective, and therefore selling as a co-op, for example, if it's cocoa or bananas or coffee, and hence an FOB, so from the co-op and not necessarily the farm or the co-op to the farm. What we have, though, introduced in the last maybe 10 years from a theoretical standpoint, and then more in the last 5 years in actual terms, is what we're calling the fair trade living income reference prices. And then those are calculated at farm gate. So that's really looking at how much does a farmer need to make from the crop they're growing to make a living income from it. So it's a completely different pricing mechanism and pricing approach. So on the first side, we really look at the minimum prices on cost of production average across sometimes a whole sector. And so in coffee, for example, it means the average cost of production in Indonesia is obviously going to be extremely different to Colombia. And even within Colombia, are you in the highlands or in the lowlands? But to say, okay, you're all under a commodity price in the stock market, or the commodity price that fluctuates and influences you all. So at least where do we set the floor price? And maybe just to come back to the living income reference price, we've also set it as a reference and not a mandatory, partly because it is so much higher in many places than what it wouldn't be needed to pay. Sometimes it's triple or quadruple the price than the market is paying right now. So if we start saying this is now what you have to pay to be fair trade certified, we know it's a huge jump that companies have to make, and that the whole supply chain needs to accept all the way down to the final retailer. And in fair trade, as we work to the final consumer, sometimes the pressure down from prices starts all the way from the consumer, who ultimately doesn't want to pay $10 for a bar of chocolate. Are they willing to pay $7, $6, maybe? Let's get them to maybe not pay $1 for 2 bars. But so I think that price pressure comes from the way across. And one point too that is very important is how farmers have been using the fair trade premium as a way to do direct investments in farmer payments. So what we're seeing in cocoa, for example, is about 20% of the fair trade premium in cocoa. Co-ops decide and vote on actually splitting it across as direct farmer payment. But it's their collective decision on what they do with the money. So do they need it as an extra cash payment, or do they need to fix the bridge so that they can all walk to the village? So sometimes also reducing their costs. So we see a lot of farmers deciding to use the premium on organizing farm collection. So instead of them having to figure out how to bring their cocoa, their wet beans, or their bananas to the point of collection of the co-op, incurring those costs themselves, or needing a truck or to pay someone to pick up their crop, that they decide that collectively as a co-op, they hire a driver and buy a car or buy a collection vehicle that goes around everyone. So by centrally reducing individual farmer costs, it's instead of saying it's a direct payment out, and really pressuring those two sides and seeing the value of what the co-op can bring as direct services and value addition to the farmers.
Great, thank you, Julie. Yeah, so I think it's great that fair trade is starting to consider like farm gate prices when using reference to living incomes. So this is a good step towards potentially defining minimum prices based on this living income, right? So yeah, I think the next question that is linked to this that you mentioned, Julie, is to Andrea. And Andrea, the Impact Institute is doing an amazing work calculating and disseminating the true price of a product, factoring the social and environmental cost of production. And you have done it for several value chains or, a specific products in coffee, cocoa, and tea. So what do you think is needed to scale up these true price analysis or models so that they are communicated and known by farmers, traders, processors, and retailers, all the actors in the value chains, but that they are also used as a price reference across commodity sectors?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for that question. So I think what's needed can roughly be divided into what's practically needed to deliver these true price analyses and what's needed in order to increase the actual uptake. So the use and organizations wanting to know the true price and make use of it. So on the practical level, I think there's three things that are really important. One is the ability to do good primary data collection and processing methods. So yeah, obviously Charlotte also already referred to primary data being really important. But being able to find the right data, but not make it a huge burden, and then being able to process it quickly is important. Second one, which links to that, is have financing for local level education. So indeed, there's so much illiteracy amongst farmers, but that's really needed so they can actually own their own data. They have to own their own data, not just for farmer income, but also towards the future, towards things like CSRD. There's only going to be more and more requests for data. And instead of just taking the data and from the farmers and not having the ownership there, they should be able to be educated to own their own data. And lastly, I think sector level data is needed. So in order to fill in gaps, do benchmarking, we can't just do everything based on primary data. So, sector level data is really necessary and useful. And then in terms of uptake, I think it starts with having good examples of how true pricing can really help in decision making. There are so many good examples out there, but to really spread the word on that and show organizations across the value chain how it can be useful. What's needed is willingness, just willingness of those organizations to start on it, to get stuck in and do it. And lastly, maybe potentially also just regulation. So governments asking to internalize externalities. Yes, I think that was it. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Andrea. Very important keys or priorities on data efforts, right? I think that's the key message from this your intervention. So let's. I want to ask Emily, from your vision as cacao buyer, Uncommon Cacao we know is one of the few cocoa traders and processors that has collected and publicly disclosed the price paid to cocoa farmers in different countries, as well as the prices paid across the value chain from production to retail. So how do you manage to do it? What have been the enabling conditions to make this happen? You are on mute, Emily.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you, Christina, and thank you to all of my fellow panelists. What an amazing conversation. Yes, as you said, Uncommon Cacao is an international specialty cacao exporter and importer. And we are a certified B Corp, a public benefit corporation. And I really started this business out of a recognition of the responsibility and opportunity for intermediaries to decommoditize the cacao industry and do business differently. So I think it's important to state that we embrace radical transparency and transparent trade, which is our model of doing sourcing, as a means to an end. I think sometimes we can think about transparency as the end itself, but it really is, for us, the enabling conditions for a global dialogue, just as we're having today on the importance of producer profitability and a different structure for the industry. So yeah, needless to say, I'm really excited about the discussion today and happy to be here. We started off reporting farm gate price and FOB price as exporters at our own operations in Central America. So we started off working in Belize from 2010 until 2014. I lived there, and we really built out an operation that was grounded in transparent pricing as our way to both be held accountable for our business operations as intermediaries, building a specialty decommoditized product, and also to demonstrate a scalable model for paying farmers higher prices. It was pretty clear to me at the time, this was, again, about 13 years ago, that existing interventions were not structurally different enough from the problems and symptoms we were seeing of the commodity market. And so we really wanted to build something that had a different system of valuing cacao. And so looking at cost of production, looking at quality, looking at a number of different factors that help to determine the sort of correct value or true price, I guess, of the cacao. And as our business grew, we scaled from Belize to Guatemala as exporters, and then in 2016 started importing cacao from now over 15 countries around the world. We began working with our partners where we were, not the boots on the ground operating, to collect a lot of pricing data from them. So from the very beginning, we've been very committed to scaling up the transparent trade approach to pricing and disclosure, even in countries where we're not having that first contact with producers. We've experimented with tech-enabled pricing transparency, but to be honest, have really struggled to find the right fit in terms of a scalable cross-context, both software and hardware solution. And so the reality is we're still doing a lot of manual data collection as well as our partners. So we each year collect things like producer receipts, buying logs, farmer logs, batch traceability data from all of our partners. And we work with auditors at the Fine Cacao and Chocolate Institute, or FCCI, which is based out of Harvard University, as auditors. And so we essentially each year run this collection process. It's a series of Google spreadsheets and Google folders where people upload data. And we've been working with FCCI on this for the past several years. The auditing step is really important because it ensures that any holes or discrepancies that might exist in the data are really examined by academics, not just by our own sort of internal private sector team. And then at the end of that process, we report outwardly our findings through the transparency report, which is available on our website. So we sort of report that in a number of different ways. We have a pricing matrix in the report that has all of the data on one page. And so it's really easy to kind of see cross geography, what prices are looking like. And then we also have for each product that we source from each country or each region, its own transparent transactions profile. We also importantly share all of our own purchasing records, so our own contracts, POs, as well as our sales data, like our granular sales data with FCCI, so that we're able to show in those transparent transactions profiles also the price at which we sold that cacao ultimately to chocolate makers. And this enables two-way transparency so that producers as well are able to access some of that information and really get a sense for what other producers are able to sell their cacao to in the specialty market. There are a lot of challenges around this, as you can imagine, with the manual collection, as well as the market demand. I think being so small is a real challenge, especially in the specialty arena, when we're, sometimes there can be an expectation around those higher prices that isn't necessarily commercially possible. That said, the key enabling conditions that we've seen so far are market buy-in to this model, which I think we've pretty well verified at this point. Trust across the value chain. We're asking our partners for a lot of potentially sensitive data. They need to trust that we're going to use that responsibly, and they also need to be bought into the concept of transparent trade. Long-term partnership. This is a hard system to implement if this is a short-term buying relationship. So really having those long-term agreements in place. And And I think also computer literacy of exporters and real trust with exporters, because as has been mentioned multiple times, you know, producers, farmers are not necessarily going to be capable of inputting the data that needs to be inputted into the system. And that also represents extra costs for them. And so we similarly see that sort of the burden of responsibility and the onus for data, that first step into the system, it tends to be, it's really important to have exporters who are on board with that.
Thank you, Emily. This is great. Thank you for sharing this example. And it shows that, you know, transparent buying relations are very important, but also I think your example shows the willingness and the commitment on data collection efforts, and it shows that it is possible and that it is needed to be replicated and supported at larger scale, right? So yeah, so before we move to the section on premiums, let's open the Q&A. Christina, I know you have some questions. Yeah.
Thanks very much. All very great interventions. And we also have the chat, a few comments and questions that resonate among the audience. I'm going to start with a comment that is also a question. There's a comment that says, for many years, these crops were not valued as they should for farmers, right? However, it is not uptaking in the value is uptaking in the value chain, right? So how can we split that value? You know, because we have seen also in the presentation, right? You know, the value is stating other actors in the value chain. If there is this price pressure that Julie mentioned about, how we can split that value? Maybe, you know, Julie, can you ask that question, please? Can you answer that question? Sorry.
I can attempt for sure. I think this question is very crop specific, and even within a crop, depends a lot on what part of the crop. You know, Emily was talking a lot about being in a specialty cocoa versus conventional cocoa. There's a world of difference. Same in the in tea, same in coffee. And bananas, you know, there's no such thing as a specialty banana, and it's typically a price loss leader in a retail supermarket, meaning they want it to be the cheapest fruit, you know, and so to get people in the door. So, and the reason that big banana companies make money is they make, you know, half a cent, but on so many bananas because there's consolidation. So how do we split the value? I think has to be first a really deep understanding of that crop's dynamic and that subsector, so that we understand where is the value staying. Is it staying somewhere in the chain, and how do we bring it back to producers? It's really difficult because we quickly get against trade laws of so many countries. In fair trade, for example, we've tried for a long time, like how can we force a certain payments or force a disclosure of prices paid further along the chain? We can encourage it, we can ask for it in certain places and internally, but for us to just publicly, automatically publish the prices paid by everyone would be breaking a lot of trade secret laws. And, you know, so it's been really challenging on how do we enforce this? And so I think it's how do we come back to what more can we do in the piece of discussion we're having on ensuring that the prices that the farmers are making meets their costs and meets their sustainable living needs. And also, like you, I think on one of your slide, you had, you know, what percentage of the value of a product stays where in the value chain, right? How much stays with the retailer, how much stays. And I think what's equally important for us to map with that is what is the percentage of costs that everyone carries, right? So if you're making 40% of the money of a final product, but you had 40% of the cost, then maybe that's fair, you know. But I think that what we're seeing is the clarity that the farmers are not getting the percentage of the value that represents their costs of it, right? So if a tea maker takes a lot of time and energy in making a beautiful tea or a beautiful chocolate, fine if they take the value out of what they've added to the product, but let's ensure how much actually the farmers are making, and is it the true part? And a big part of that is transparency and is pushing. I'll close on saying, like, one huge part of our work that I think we need to push more collectively to ensure that is ultimately final prices to consumers and to companies need to increase for all of this to create more space. In tea, the reason we cannot create an impact on income is because we only managed to sell about 4% of the fair trade tea on fair trade terms. Because the tea market is so compressed, like people buying black tea, drinking tea, want it cheap, have had it cheap since the global penetration of tea. It's always been a cheap commodity. And so increasing that, it needs, and partly because we then set a minimum price and the tea industry is like, no, this is too high, like this is too big. And so it's not so much about where can we set higher prices. If that leads us to only selling a tiny fraction or not able to sell, then we're not better off. So I think we need to continue a huge consumer education and brand and trader education and push, and partly with legislation as well, to say like because there are some crops where there is value in the chain to be recaptured and reshared with farmers. But there are other crops where that isn't even there. Everyone's just taking their little bit. So we need to increase the pie so that we can bring a fair portion back to the farmers.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Elie, for the answer. Let's take another one before we move to the next part of the dialogue. It's a question to Charlotte, Dr. Charlotte. How can governments help to enforce this price transparency in a trading system? You mentioned about this, commodity exchange. I mean, how can governments help on this?
Well, thank you very much, Christina. Well, there's a lot of things that the government can do actually to help in the implementation of a local commodity exchange. One is, first of all, the political willingness to have a commodity exchange. Secondly, the government could participate in terms of becoming probably a shareholder in the commodity exchange. Thirdly, the government can make it mandatory, like they've done in Ethiopia, that all the export commodities have to go through the commodity exchange. I think, I'm not sure whether it was Julie or who was talking about the data that they have to collect, for instance. But as a buyer, buyers always use intermediaries to get to the farmers. Most exporters don't go straight to the farmers. They use so many agents. An agent can take advantage of the farmer. An agent can buy the coffee, let's say for $1 and they'll write on a receipt $2 paid. So as such, you can see that some of the data can be biased. So in order to get something that is actually accurate, we need a warehouse receipt. Because a warehouse receipt means that we have an institution that is there, and their role is to make sure that they provide accurate information about the price. The warehouse receipt will state clearly how much the cocoa is worth, the quality of the cocoa, and also the quantity of the cocoa. Such data is more accurate than a data that has been collected by an agent, which is an intermediary. Because the agent, we cannot trust an agent, really. Whereas having an institution is more formal and we have more accurate information from them. Unless the government, because we can see, for instance, in Ghana, Ghana is a cocoa exporter. They have a commodity exchange. Everything else is sold on the commodity exchange except the cocoa. What do we make of while having a commodity exchange, we cannot set the main export commodity through the exchange. That's strange. And again, when we have the commodity exchange, there are many issues that they have, other panelists have already discussed. We can exercise a controversial power when we have a commodity exchange. Why? Because the commodity exchange primary goal is to organize the farmers into cooperatives. And the fact that they are in cooperatives is difficult when they are together for an agent to try to bribe or to take advantage of any kind. So the government has a lot to do, really, but again, it has to involve, establishing a commodity exchange is not just down to the government, unfortunately. The private sectors, such as banks, also have to be willing to get involved because they have to obviously endorse the services of the commodity exchange, as well as having buyer organizations and also farmer organizations on board.
Thanks very much, Dr. Charlotte. Very useful and highlighting few remarks that governments can do, in particular the role of warehouse receipts is very important. Stephanie, back to you.
Yeah, thank you. All great questions. Thank you to our panel for these answers. I will give the floor to Ms. Rupal Verma. She's going to share some words of reflections before a second round of questions. So Ms. Verma works for the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, and she also serves as a Secretary Advisor for the United Nations Forum on Sustainability Standards, with whom we work very closely. So it is an honor to have you here, Rupal, and go ahead, please share your remarks.
Thanks so much, Stephanie, Christine, and thanks to all the panelists for this great discussion. Stephanie, thanks also for the introduction. So we've been working in the UNFSS, which is the United Nations Forum on Sustainability Standards, very closely with IASD, but also we are a member agency of 6 UN members, where voluntary sustainability standards is something that you can't escape given the name of the forum. But bringing back, we've heard so many interesting things already on transparency, trust, and how, value needs to be determined based on the value of the commodity that's being sold. The only thing that I want to bring back the discussion to before we move to the next round is that the importance of this topic, given how much we have been hearing now with the regulations that are coming in and how prices are going to shift and the burden is going to shift to the smallholders, irrespective of the regulations saying how businesses need to absorb this kind of a price shift or a price burden that will come through these regulations. And this will fall back then on tools like voluntary sustainability standards that have been already existing in the markets across these value chains, and how they can support to have a better transparency and better trust in the system across the value chains. Through our research as a part of the UNFSS, we've seen that more often than not, the role of governments, as we saw also in the panel discussion here, has been, for long discussed. We've already discussed how commodity boards can be set up, exchange values can be more transparent, how export prices can be more transparent, but then there's also a focus that needs to shift more on businesses, how businesses are working. When we already heard from Uncommon Cacao how it's a new shift towards this business model, but then there are also bigger players. For example, we heard of the Sankofa project, which is being run by Halba, the chocolate that is from a co-op. So where they're working with fair trade, they are working with other civil society organizations, to ensure that the prices that are going to the farmers is not just the minimum wage, it's not just the minimum price, it's a living wage. It's something that the farmers can really make a living out of. And there is when is time for us now to explore, okay, standards come with their own inherent challenges, but there's some benefits which we already saw in Stephanie's presentation that they bring with them as a nature of how they have operated for 2 decades or even more. So this now needs to merge together to, have a bit more of a multi-stakeholder and landscape approach where really prices percolate down the value chain and not just benefit the businesses that are working towards getting profit, of course. And I will stop it at it for now.
Excellent. Very good, Rupal. Thanks very much for commenting. Before we move to the next part of the panel, we have a question here to Emily that I consider is important, focus on transparency. Emily, do the buyers of your cocoa also commit to price transparency as they sell their product further down the supply chain? If so, what makes these companies willing to do this when so many aren't? It is simply a commitment to the concept of transparency and equality for the farmer, or is there something else about them? So how you make sure this price transparency is enforced in your supply chain?
Yeah, thank you, Christina. And I dropped a note in the chat as well. Basically, what we see is similar to what I think the specialty sector tends to sort of be the leading edge, I think, on a lot of these changes, because there's more flexibility and consumer willingness to pay for products that are considered premium. And so we, I think for a lot of the chocolate companies that we sell to, they're using price transparency to help educate consumers and communicate on the higher value of their products. And I think in a world where prices are going to be increasing to consumers, which, as we've all been saying, they certainly are, I think, that price transparency so that consumers can understand that when they're paying a higher price for a product, it's not just because the retailer or the manufacturer is taking a higher margin, like demonstrating that the producer themselves are actually earning, at least a higher price and ideally getting to, a living income price or higher. That's going to be critical prerequisite for consumer adoption of higher prices for these products.
Yep. Thanks very much, Emily. Thanks
Thank you,
for everyone.
Emily.
Yeah.
So we can move to the next round of questions related on premiums for standard compliant products. So let's start with Andrea. And as we have seen, one of the recommendations that we have included in the reports is that premiums for more sustainable products need to be tied to the cost of externalities. So how can these voluntary sustainability standards use available information through price in a given value chain to design or update their prices and premiums models?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. I think there's a lot of different things that they could do. So I think first step is always kind of insight into materiality. And often that's already clear, but if not, true pricing can really help with that to see, okay, what are really the biggest impacts, the largest indicators, what should we be looking at in terms of natural social capital externalities. And that can also inform sustainability standards, right, in designing their programs. I think next to that, it can really help in, for instance, redirecting bonuses towards sustainable practices of farmers. It can help in financing the right investments for future-proof solutions that farmers can undertake. And of course, we've talked about it a lot. It can really help in setting gate prices that are actually towards a living income. So under-earning is one of the impacts that is part of the true price. So it can inform sustainability standards on what the current farmer income is and what the living income is. So where should they go? And I think we all know this, but I just want to stress this point that price or living income is not only one of the impacts in a true price, but also really the biggest driver of a lot of other externalities, right? So it's a huge driver of child labor, it's a huge driver of forced labor, of health and safety issues, but also of natural capital impact. So biodiversity loss and not being able to go towards climate resilient systems. And then lastly, they can even use it towards consumers, right? So let consumers voluntarily pay the true price where the additional money can be spent as remediation towards the farmers.
Great, thank you, Andrea. These are very useful, very specific ways on how standards can use the true price. And I have another question. Is the true price calculations or the models that you do dependent on the good practices that a producer or a farm can implement and the results that they obtain?
It can be. So I think the outcome of the true price calculation is always really dependent on the scope of the measurements. So the scope of your measurements can differ based on what part of the value chain is in scope, which impacts are in scope, what's your geographical scope, but also are you purely using primary data or are you also using secondary data? And of course, what is your target population? So all of those choices are really important in what is the outcome of your true price. But they should be led by what is actually the goal of your measurement. So why are you going to calculate a true price? And those goals can be super different, right? So it can, for example, be I want to create awareness towards my consumers. I want to make them be able to make an informed decision on whether they want to use cow milk or oat milk in their coffee. Well, in that case, you can really just use sector level averages for them to be able to make that decision, and you don't need primary data or data based on different production systems. If your goal is to inform pricing strategies to increase farmer income, you might only need to be looking at under earning. You don't need to have the full true price in scope, and you can combine the primary data of your target population potentially with secondary data if there's data gaps. If your goal is really to encourage a sustainable production system with monetary incentives, then you do need primary data that really distinguishes between the total impact of these different production systems, and also that you can tie to individual farmers. So yeah, let the goal inform the scope of your treatments.
It really depends on the goal. Thank you, Andrea. So based on this, Julie, I have a question for you. So do you think fair trade price and premium models can take some ideas or consider the true price or the cost of externalities in their price and premium models?
We've actually, I mean, in 2019, we did a really interesting piece of work with true price and true cost. So like with the Impact Institute on externalities in bananas to understand a bit what you were discussing, Andrea, like what is the difference between the externalities of a fair trade organic banana or a fair trade or only fair trade banana versus a conventional banana of the same origin. So are we already, by the fact of asking certain environmental standards and, for example, diminishing the environmental footprint or externalities of a fair trade banana, and especially on the social side, realizing that a lot of externalities were much lower in a fair trade banana than a conventional one, which for us was a really interesting study to do, not only to understand like our own impact of what the standards contribute to internalizing some of the externalities, but also a huge tool to go out to market and retailers to explain to say, yes, the price of a fair trade banana is higher, but actually your then externalities are so much lower. And here's the proof by someone who really looked at the externalities. And over time, we've looked at some of the way, like what are measured in the ways that we develop standards. And so not necessarily just the way we develop a minimum price, but the way we think of what standard compliance looks like. So are we helping embed into the product some of the externalities? So if we're looking at child labor protection, for example, in cocoa, if we say we do absolutely nothing, then everything is an externality, versus if we embed child protection or child protection monitoring within the co-op and within the community, yes, you're paying a higher price for the fair trade cocoa, but part of that is you're building some preventative measures inside your supply chain. So we've definitely worked alongside the context. But then just to give you a sense of the difference in scale of the price point you're getting at, when we looked at the findings from this study on bananas, we were looking that, sector-wide, like the externalities of a regular banana was about $7. A fair trade banana was about $3.60. So we were already about half of the external cost. But then when we look at actually what the price is that the, trade is willing to pay for bananas. And this is bananas is a really interesting product to talk about price, because if you go to the supermarket, there's only two bananas. There's the conventional and the organic, and maybe that organic is fair trade, or if you're in the UK, sometimes you have the chance that both are a fair trade choice. But whereas in chocolate or cocoa, consumers are faced with huge amount of choices, or tea, or most other products, right? So you can have more expensive products, quality differentials, taste. In bananas, it's really in your face. What is the difference between these two? And so we need to convince ultimately the retailer who's putting those two bananas there, and the consumer sees the difference right in their eyes. Do I pick this one or this one? They look the same, they taste the same, but one is going to be probably double the price. And so explaining, when that's with education of the final consumer point of sale, we see that it actually works. Like people are willing to pick the fruit that's double the price, like not a couple of cents, like double the price that they see on the ad, if they know, if it's visually clear why and where the impact of those extra payment they're making is. So working alongside tools like the true price model really helps us make that point come across to decision makers, which in this case is the retailer. In the cocoa and chocolate industry, typically the decision makers is the brands or the traders in the middle. So having that to explain, like, yes, fair trade is more expensive, but here's why, and here's what it actually helps you contribute.
Great, thank you, Julie. Now, to finalize, I want to ask one question to Emily, one to Charlotte. So, Emily, what are the top 2-3 practices that commodity buyers and processors can implement to ensure that farmers, producers receive a price that is stable over time, and also that reflects a product's true price? If you can share 2-3 key points. You're on mute.
Thank you. I wish I could share the silver bullet solution. I think, as all of the panelists have mentioned, it's really complex, and so much is context specific and commodity specific. That said, the prerequisite for looking at any of these interventions is a decoupling from the commodity price. So I think if we're talking about, if any commodity buyer or processor is serious about a living income or working towards true price, mechanisms, then they need to be divorced from the commodity market. So that has to be practice number one. And that in itself is a massive undertaking for most buyers because of the way that their systems work. And so I think if we could even just start with one and get more buyers comfortable with the concept of direct relationships with their suppliers and a long-term approach to pricing, both on the supplier and the buyer perspective, or on sort of both sides of that equation, then we would be making great strides towards being able to then engage in like the suite of practices that are available to buyers who are working outside of the sort of constraints of the commodity market. I love the true price approach. Andrew, I definitely want to follow up with you after this and learn more. But I think there's also, in the cocoa world specifically, just even looking at cost plus pricing. So really understanding cost of production, starting with the producers. We've worked with the team at 60 decibels on this and can highly recommend them. Their sort of farmer listening tools are really helpful for understanding some of the cost of production elements that we were not aware of. And then I think, there are a lot of different ways to look at living income. So that would be a next step is, once you have cost of production, looking at living income. Beyond the sort of cost plus strategies, I think there is a lot that buyers can be doing around the way that higher prices are paid to farmers. One of the challenges that we've seen is in premium models where the premiums are distributed to farmers once a year, like after an annual general meeting of a cooperative. That can be helpful in some cases because it can be income that's coming in at a time of year when the crop isn't in harvest, and that can go towards school fees or other fees that might not be covered during the harvest season. And then, but at the same time, depending on the community context, there could also be more benefit to that premium just being a part of the farm gate price that is paid at the time of sale of the farmer, of that fresh fruit or crop. So again, all of this is depending on the context, and understanding what the best practice is to use in your specific chain is going to depend on dialogue with your suppliers. So again, having that relationship, really being able to listen, not just to the farmers, but also to the exporters and others in the value chain, because their costs need to be considered too, if we really want to be avoiding the externalities on labor practices, environmental practices, and other social and environmental impacts that can be created by sort of pushing risk and pushing responsibility for externalities out of the cost and price calculations.
Great, thank you, Emily. And Dr. Charlotte, based on this comment, like the possibilities or the potentials to divorce from the commodity market, what can be done about the influence of futures markets on this?
Well,
I know it's a big question, yeah.
It's quite complex. I wish, we had a straight answer to this question. I think it's more complex than probably what we can see here when it comes to the price of this commodity. To give you just one simple example, look at the coffee. Coffee is produced in other countries, but the price is quoted in America, okay? It's the intercontinental exchange that will give the price, the international price of the coffee. And they do that based on the equilibrium price, which is determined by the market forces, demand and supply. So two variables that no one can control. Okay. Then once the price is quoted on the intercontinental exchange, the local commodity exchange, for instance, in Ethiopia, will begin to do what we call the price discovery, where they will identify from the bidders the buyers, as they bid, they give the offer, they bid the quantity they want and the price they are willing to pay, because it's only the floor price that the floor price that is given, but there's no ceiling. So that allows the buyers to give some offer and also the quantity they want. And once this price also is determined, we know what quantity can be sold at what price, then we release the domestic price. And even that domestic price, when it gets to the farm gate, there are so many other factors that get into play. For instance, transportation, how far they are from the exchange, all these things will come as a deduction from the farmers, the price that the farmer get. So you can see the complexity of the price of the commodity itself. The problem with the price premium, I really appreciate them because it's a plus. Anything that gives a plus to the farmers is welcome. But they don't actually fix the problem because we have structural changes that are required within the sector. The price premium will not do any good. The price premium will not do any good because let's assume that they tell you only 80% of the price, domestic price that is being released is paid to the farmers. What do we do with the 20%? What do we do with the 30%? What do we do with the 40%? It's not. And the premium is the same. During my presentation at the UN, I did mention how the premium, for instance, farmers do not receive the premium as it was stated. The living income differentials, it says $400 per ton. But we all know that currencies either appreciate or depreciate against each other. But for Ghana, for instance, $400 from 2020 to 2023 is the same exchange rate. Mm-hmm. Again, we can see the transparency issue here. So yes, price premium are good. In fact, if we want to promote that, there are easy ways to do that. For instance, we can, if the government really wants to promote, sustainable farming practices, etc., they can do that. They can do that by promoting it. They can do that by, first of all, providing a subsidy for the initial cost, because it comes with a cost to the farmers. So that initial cost, money has to be found somewhere. Farmers do not have access to bank loans. So they need to get money somewhere to do the initial investment. So the government can do that through subsidies. And once it's done, we want to promote giving certificate, for instance, to the farmers who are more sustainable farming practices, making a big party announcement, giving them certificate, giving them award. All these things will also encourage others to do the same. But the problem here is the money. It all goes back to the money. And you get even certain farmers, for instance, in Cote d'Ivoire, where the products are taken and it can go up to 6 months before they get the payment. How do you expect these farmers to think about sustainable farming practices? It's a joke. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, they are in majority. So really, as much as we want to maintain these, premium price premium strategies, they are good, but we need something much, much more than this in the sector that we are dealing with.
Yeah, thank you.
That's what I can say, Stephanie.
Yeah, it's a structural change, basically. So yeah, over to you, Christina. Let's finalize.
Yeah, thanks very much. We are really at the hour. Just would like to give a final word to Rupal. If you want to share something very quickly before we wrap up and we close, really 30 seconds, your key message here.
My key message I'm going to take from Charlotte: we need to have a structural change. Unless that comes into picture, we bring price premiums, we bring minimum prices, we bring so on and so forth. As long as businesses operate as they operate, as long as governments don't have incentives or don't incentivize sustainable practices, there's only so far we can go with sustainable tools or standards or regulations, even for that matter. So as long as that does not happen, as long as dependence on middlemen does not decrease, for example, that does not happen, there's only so far we can go in all the efforts that we are doing, but we must keep going.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks very much, everybody, for all this outstanding conversation. Very great points, very insightful. The audience was being very engaged. Let's continue. Transparency and changing these structural issues are key in our ISD mission, and we look forward to continue engaging with you on this path. Thank you so much, and we will share the recordings with you all. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you.